Testing, one, two. Hello. Okay, it's on. If the microphone is on, then that means I'm starting. I am so sorry that I was sick last week. Um, I think I had flu type A, and there is a solid chance that today's class may be accompanied by some unpleasant throat noises. So just brace yourselves. But thank you all so much for banding together and doing that wonderful study of Daniel that you did last week. And we will get to the Persian period awfully soon, but we will finish, we'll have to cut the Roman period a week short because I got ill and we have the rest of the class to do. But picking up from where we were 2 weeks ago, as a matter of first importance, I need to make an adjustment to the reconstruction of the winter of Paul's third missionary journey. Since I'm only able to prepare this class 1 week in advance at a time, and my sources are not designed to be complementary to each other, some adjustments like this will be necessary, with my apologies. Although historical reconstruction should always be an ongoing endeavor. What I am going through with you in this quarter are historical models and not the final word. Now, as we address all the books of the New Testament written during the reign of Nero, I had put 2 Corinthians as the earliest in that group. But my studies for this week have led me to believe that that slot should perhaps go to 1 Timothy or Titus. As you'll recall from a couple weeks ago, Paul ended his third missionary journey by bookending a winter in Roman Greece with some time in Macedonia, after which he spent over a month getting back to Jerusalem. I would suggest to you now that this would probably have been around the changing of the year from 57 to 58. Nero would have been in his third year as emperor and around 20 years old. 1 Timothy 1:3 suggests that Paul's time in Macedonia had not yet ended when he wrote 1 Timothy, and that he had yet to make the return trip through Ephesus that he would on his way back to Jerusalem. This is that moment when he gathered all the Ephesian elders together and said, "Bye, behave yourselves." But there is also an adjustment to make to where Paul spent that winter. I mentioned 2 weeks ago how Acts 20 verses 1 through 3 records that Paul spent that winter in Greece. It's right about the middle here. And I had recommended at the time that in the first century AD, Greece essentially amounted to the region of Achaia, of which Corinth was the capital. But there was a little more to Roman Greece than just the area around Corinth, and as it turns out, Paul's letter to Titus indicates that Paul may have spent at least part of that winter in just such an extra Corinthian location, in Greek Nicopolis, which is mentioned in Titus 3:12, which was right on the border with Roman Macedonia. I've got the little Google Maps dot over here, and you can see Corinth is all the way down here. Nicopolis, again, is mentioned in Titus 3:12 as where Paul is telling Titus, he expects Titus to be able to find him when he leaves Crete. Now, here's a little picture of what Nicopolis was actually like in the first century based on the excavation survey. Here's a broader landscape view of the area and its sacred hinterland landscape. But Nicopolis was right on the border with Roman Macedonia, over 130 miles from Corinth to the west. Paul's focus on Titus in 2 Corinthians also helps to paint this picture of Paul's winter from 57 to the spring of 58. Paul had Timothy working in Ephesus, while Titus worked at the apostles' behest to build up the church on Crete. Titus also ended up bringing a fresh report to Paul about the state of the church in Corinth, after which Paul wrote 2 Corinthians, which report he mentions in 2 Corinthians. And having returned to Corinth after Titus' report, either at the end of that winter or in early spring, where he wrote Romans, then we know from the book of Acts that he got into about as much trouble upon returning to Jerusalem as he had anticipated. So here we are in the springtime, back in Judea, between May or June of AD 58, since that's when Passover would have been. Acts 23 records that within the days of his arrest at the Temple Mount, Paul ended up imprisoned within Herod the Great's old palace at Caesarea Maritima. Here's a picture of it now. Zoom out just a smidge and put on some nice drawing, and this is what it looked like at the time. Now, then. Now, then. That's kind of fun, isn't it? But in any case, this palace had come to be used as the preferred residence for the governor of Roman Palestine. Although the Christian community that would have grown out from the origin point of Cornelius' household in this city would have been present within a square mile or two, we have no knowledge of the Caesarean church's interaction with Paul during his imprisonment in Herod's palace, which lasted for just over another 2 years. You'll recall that although he was initially imprisoned in Caesarea, which would have been in AD 58, Paul was actually under the charge of 2 consecutive Roman procurators during this time. Antonius Felix, we aren't given the first name of either one in Scripture, but we know him from Roman inscriptions. Antonius Felix had been in charge since AD 52. This is an illustration of one of his coins. 2 years before Nero had succeeded Claudius as emperor, Felix had taken over as procurator in Roman Palestine. Felix had a hard time with the movements of the anti-Roman Jewish factions that were already milling about. We've mentioned the Zealots. Remember that one of Jesus' disciples was from an anti-Roman faction called the Zealots. And the year after Nero happened to have his own mother executed, just so you're keeping track of how his character is developing, Nero removed Felix from his post in Palestine in AD 59 or 60. That year, Nero, who was now about 22, had other things to be worried about besides the eastern provinces. All the way over in Roman Britain, a tribal queen named Boudica had started a major revolt in response to exploitations under Roman rule, and her forces were successfully destroying major Roman settlements in Britain. If you want to look up Boudica's revolt, there are just books and books and books and books and books. But Nero's hope might have been that the infusion of fresh leadership in Palestine could deal with the problems there without his further concern. One of Nero's number one qualities was that he preferred not to have to be dutiful. So when he could find somebody else who could be dutiful for him, that was the goal. And Nero replaced Felix with Porcius Festus, who remained procurator based in Caesarea until AD 62. As you can see, archaeology has not been as kind. This picture of wheat and an inscription that does not even bear his name is the best artifact that I could actually find associated with Festus. It's a low denomination bronze coin from his time as procurator in Judea. Poor guy is left with a stalk of wheat. Have no idea what he looks like. But in any case, probably didn't have a beard. Hadrian made those popular. But anyway, free with your tuition. Festus allowed, it seems Acts 25 indicates that Paul's case was one of Festus's first orders of business. Festus allowed Paul to appeal to Nero, which involved sending the apostle to Rome. From the details of Acts 27 through 28, we know that it took Paul over 3 months to get to Rome, including spending a winter on Malta, which means that Paul arrived in Rome in the spring of AD 60 or 61. By the time of his actual arrival in Rome, around 4 years had passed since he'd written his letter to the believers in that city. So it'd been a hot minute. Now, back in Rome and Palestine, Festus continued to deal with the problems he inherited from Felix. The tension between Jewish religious leadership, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the anti-Roman factions, even Christian leadership had continued to be tense alongside those parties' tensions with the remnants of the Herod family, who still maintained internal political control of the Jewish nation. Herod Agrippa II, a great-grandson of Herod the Great, essentially balanced the tensions between Roman and Jewish ethnic politics by himself. The Sadducees and the Herods were passive-aggressively at odds in Jerusalem around AD 61. Agrippa had added a major dining hall to the Herodian palace in Jerusalem, and he had built it high enough that he could view the operations in the Jerusalem temple's inner court from the window. And he was directly involved with these matters by his position. It was even within Herod Agrippa II's power to appoint the high priest based on the guidance of Rome. The resistant elements of the priesthood in Jerusalem, in response, had an additional wall built on the Temple Mount specifically so that Agrippa's view of the inner court and the view of any visiting Roman official or soldiers was obstructed. Festus instructed the priesthood to dismantle this new wall, but he allowed the priests to appeal directly to Caesar, to Nero, who ended up allowing the wall to stay. That same year, a serious Jewish-Greek confrontation also happened right under Festus's nose in Caesarea. Some of the local Greeks put a new building up so physically close to the synagogue in Caesarea that it impeded the Jews' ability to get into the building. Festus, as usual, allowed the case to go to Caesar. But in this case, Nero sided with the Greeks. This did not go over well with the Jews. Poorly enough indeed that particular episode could be interpreted as foundational for the Jewish revolt that was to come, as we'll see. As we mentioned last time we were together, Matthew may have been actively composing his gospel around this time, operating primarily within a Jewish community, writing his gospel in Hebrew and then translating it for his fellow Gentile believers, respectively. So Matthew's most likely period of composition overlaps with tense events like this, as well as the events of Acts 21 and following. Matthew was inspired to demonstrate the superiority of a received Christ over all of these continually moving parts and passions in Jewish and Roman political life. Such tensions were not becoming any more of an answer to Israel's problems than they had been during Jesus' ministry. And in addition to the fact that the eternal kingdom of God was actually getting started cosmically, Matthew was probably trying to make the Jesus movement as accessible and reasonable as possible to his increasingly frustrated fellow Jews. While the church seems to have been received well in domestic circles, growing in favor with all the people and such reports like that. Even among some Pharisees, right? The religious leadership centered in Jerusalem seems to have maintained a hard line of resistance against accepting that Jesus of Nazareth had been the predicted Messiah, or that God's people, as an ideal group, could include Gentiles, without their conversion into the Jewish community itself. Such circumstances are clearly evidenced by the events of Paul's return to Jerusalem, as well as the occasional arrest of apostles and the stoning of Stephen in years prior. And in the model of the composition of the Gospels that I'll suggest for this class, it would have been around the same time as the beginning of Paul's house arrest in Rome in AD 61 that Luke may have begun to build on the Apostle Matthew's Gospel memoir. Luke was not one of Christ's chosen apostles, as many of you know. He'd come to belief in Christ later as a disciple of Paul. And while he may have gotten around, he was not a direct witness to Jesus' ministry in Rome and Palestine. That said, he and the former tax collector, Matthew, ended up somehow with a unique literary relationship at least. The gospel memoirs of Matthew and Luke share 235 verses, almost verbatim in Greek, that are not in the Gospel of Mark. There's debate over which came first, but at least between Matthew and Luke, Matthew has the natural historical advantage. Matthew was geographically and personally closer to Jesus' birth family and the other apostles before Luke could have been, and he remembered Jesus' ministry firsthand. Luke himself even depicts himself as a beneficiary of those who, quote, who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke 1, verse 2, a group which included Matthew. So Luke could have even acquired a copy of Matthew's gospel in Greek, with which he shares 235 statements about verbatim, prior to his departure from Caesarea with Paul during Paul's imprisonment in Palestine. It actually makes a lot of sense to me, speculative though it is, for Luke to have spent the 2 years that Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea with the primary sources that would shape his gospel memoir. So, for now, it seems like Luke used Matthew and Mark's work, which he might have acquired upon arrival in Rome, as the basis for a Jesus memoir intended for at least one worthwhile individual named Theophilus. Right? The addressee of the books of both Luke and Acts is Theophilus. Whoever Theophilus was, he was the primary beneficiary of the single most detailed biography of Jesus' life that we have, as well as the primary account in Acts of the spread of Christianity among Gentiles, with the book of Acts focused primarily on the contributions of Peter and then Paul, the two apostles who pioneered the gospel into Gentile space, and the two apostles who spent the most time ministering within the city of Rome in particular. It is plausible that Rome itself was a primary place of composition for Luke, and that the document of his gospel memoir was meant to compensate for the onset of Paul's house arrest. Paul mentioned Luke to Timothy as being in Rome during this time, and at the end of one of the letters that we will mention. So after his arrival in Rome as a prisoner in the spring of AD 61 or 62, plausibly overlapping with the starting phase of Luke's gospel, Paul took to writing his still surviving letters to his Christian family in Ephesus, Colossae, and Philippi, his preserved personal letter to Philemon, and the second preserved letter to Timothy. It's clear that while in Rome, Paul did his best to maintain his connections and encourage the church at large, using as many willing participants as possible. Paul's letter to the believers in Ephesus is clearly aimed at a phase of the church in that city that had come about since he was last there at the end of his third missionary journey, now a few years ago. This letter came by the hand of another Roman Asian disciple who Paul names as Tychicus, who had been a believer at least since Paul's third missionary journey, according to Acts 20. After this, it seems like Paul wrote the second of his letters that we have to Timothy, which might place us early, which we have to Timothy because 2 Timothy calls for Timothy to join Paul while also mentioning that Tychicus had already been sent to Ephesus. 2 Timothy 1:12. Paul also requests Timothy's arrival before winter, which might place us earlier than that season in AD 62. Timothy had joined Paul in Rome by the time Paul wrote a shorter version of the same message he had for believers in Ephesus to the comparatively backwater town of Colossae. Colossae was also in the province of Roman Asia and was also sent using Tychicus, according to Colossians 4:7. The other names mentioned in Colossians 4 make it clear that after Timothy's arrival, another Christian in Rome named Aristarchus had been imprisoned. But John Mark had also made himself available for a missionary journey on Paul's behalf, and a Colossian believer named Epaphras was working elsewhere in the Lycus Valley at Paul's behest in settlements close to Colossae called Laodicea and Hierapolis. Luke was still by Paul's side, according to Colossians 4, as well as another believer named Demas. And by the time Paul and Timothy send a second letter to Colossae to a slave owner among the believers named Philemon and his house church, Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke were all in Rome again, but Epaphras had also was now the one to be imprisoned, rather than Aristarchus. At some point in this year, the church in Philippi sent Epaphroditus to serve Paul as well, according to Philippians 2, verses 25 through 30. Philippi was a formal Roman colony in Greece. As a Roman settlement, its initial purpose was to serve as a place of retirement for Roman soldiers. Paul also expected Timothy to make a trip there and back as well. Again, all these correspondences were probably done by the end of AD 62. And let's not forget that by the time Paul was writing to the church in Philippi in AD 62, he had managed to get the gospel into the hearts of some of Nero's household, though we do not know the individuals. The household of a Roman emperor included his spouses and biological family, but also any Roman civil officer who worked directly with Caesar, as well as all of Caesar's legal dependents, both slave and free, and his personal guard. So there are a lot of options to choose from in terms of the scope of Caesar's household, and we don't know, and we shouldn't just choose. But next to an encroaching, character-focused gospel message, Nero's behavior would have offered quite the contrast to the royal household who was hearing this message. In AD 62, Nero's longtime friend and mentor, Burrus, had passed away. Yes, sir.
I'm always put under the impression Paul was in a Roman prison, but Paul was let out, and he's arrested again later.
Spoilers.
Paul wrote 1 Timothy when he was in the Roman prison the first time. He was let out, arrested the second time, and then the second time he wrote 2 Timothy because 2 Timothy reads like a farewell letter.
Yes. That is a possible model. That is a possible model, but it is not mine today. And we will get to whatever happened to good old Paul. So, Yes, but we're still a year away from that. So, in AD 62, Nero's longtime friend and mentor, Burrus, passed away, and this had a major impact upon Seneca's own ability to restrain Nero to decent action. Within the year, Nero had his wife Octavia, daughter of Claudius, executed on charges of adultery. Nero had been cheating on her for years, as a matter of fact, but Octavia was barren and Nero's mistress was now pregnant, so it seemed the perfect time to him. Now, his treatment of Octavia in this whole episode, who was a year or two younger and had been perceived publicly as a dutiful wife, did not go over well with the citizenry of Rome. The church seems to have been faring much better in comparison, to be honest, than Nero in terms of public opinion. Since Paul only ever mentioned one fellow prisoner at a time during this period of composition, Aristarchus and then Epaphras, we might infer that any persecution of Christians in the city of Rome up to this point amounted to little more than the very limited and occasional imprisonment of individual believers alongside Paul's own ongoing house arrest. Back in Roman Palestine, however, things had been getting much more tense. Economic extortion had continued to be a major factor. Porcius Festus had plundered whole cities and villages for their resources, and then he seems to have died in office in AD 62, which created a short gap in the Roman power structure in Palestine. Before Festus's successor Albinus could arrive, the high priest at the time, Annas II, took the opportunity to execute the apostle James, the half-brother of Jesus. This was seen as extreme to many, and the Pharisees actually used James's death as a further point of contention with the Sanhedrin. The Pharisees actually filed charges against the high priest to Agrippa II, who quickly deposed Annas from office. It's quite possible that James was the last remaining apostle in Jerusalem in AD 62, though that is not certain. It's just suggested by the fact that Annas probably could have managed to execute more than one apostle if more than one had been around. Peter then was probably elsewhere. We know from Acts 12 that Peter had left Jerusalem years before for some time, and we know from Acts 15 that Peter had formally returned to Jerusalem to discuss the advent of Gentile believers alongside Paul. But Peter's greater career, is demonstrated between his and Paul's epistles. Paul's letters demonstrate that Peter, also known to diaspora Jews as Cephas, was known to the church in Syrian Antioch, Galatians 2, the church in Roman Galatia, Galatians 1, and the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1 and 3 and 9 and 15. And 1 Peter 1:1, which Peter wrote in Rome, so there's a contact to that church as well, also demonstrates his connections to the Christians in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So by AD 62, Peter had gotten around. He was not just living in Jerusalem. Now, the completion of the book of Acts necessarily postdates the end of Paul's house arrest and Luke's gospel memoir, since the gospel work is referenced at the beginning of the document, and this latter work ends without word of Paul going to trial. Luke's last preserved words to Theophilus are that Paul, during house arrest, had been, quote, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching things about the Lord Jesus Christ with all openness, unrestricted. Acts 28:31. The document probably ends here because Luke and Theophilus were informed of what happened to Paul next as a matter of current events. But at this point, which would be about AD 63, the facts of the apostle's life become much, much harder to reconstruct. There is a notion of a fourth missionary journey, but quite frankly, this is based on Paul's mention of his desire to go to Spain that he mentions in his letter to the Romans, which was written years ago. And we have no actual biblical verification or easy verification that that actually happened. Simply, the desire that it was his intention. You know, back in AD 57, it was his intention. And here we are in AD 63, and the story technically stops. There are three possible contexts for the end of Paul's ministry and life. It is possible that Nero rejected Paul's appeal and had him executed in 63. That's an option. If not, then Paul would have been free to go, but the consistent understanding of the early church is that Paul died in Rome, which implies that he returned if he ever left. In that case, a second potential occasion for Paul's death would have been in AD 64. A sensical one, a not so random one at least, when Nero enforced a major episode of Christian persecution within the city of Rome. On the 19th of July, AD 64, a fire started near the Circus Maximus. Keep your eye on the rectangle. Now, it blazed for 9 days. What I'm about to show you is a reconstruction from Tacitus. It blazed for 9 days in total. Here is the Circus Maximus again, which is hazed out by fire. This is day 3. This is day 7. This is day 9. The fire in Rome. The Roman historian Tacitus was only 8 years old at the time that this happened, but his later writings on the matter are our primary witness to the Great Fire of Rome. Archaeology has not been able to confirm Tacitus's scope of recollection, as the Great Fire is only archaeologically evident in 15 to 20% of the first century urban area. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all relate the terrible possibility that Nero planned the fire to make room for the new imperial palace that he eventually built afterwards atop the contiguous remains of the Palatine, the Caelian, and the Esquiline districts, right in here. This palace he called the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. Before that got built, however, Nero did not refrain from casting blame in a different direction in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. Quote, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order." You know, Nero telling it for it to happen. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, pardon the Old English translation. Mischievous probably means like hard to pin down. And superstitio was the Roman term for anything that was not official sanctioned Roman religion. Thus, checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made back in Nero's day, not Jesus's. An arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty to being a Christian, that is. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show of Christian deaths in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed. If Paul was not killed at trial in 63, if he got to leave and come back, he could have been one of the Christians who died in Nero's post-fire persecution. In truth, Peter could have been among this number as well. There are a number of things we could consider from Tacitus' passage itself, but for the morning, I want to note just one thing. Nero's persecution of Christians in the city of Rome, while a major episode, only reached the extent that it did on the basis of Nero's own authority and cruelty. He did not champion some new and contagious view of Christians that suddenly spread far and wide. This was his deal. And this same episode was ultimately limited by the fact that the persecution was not seen as a meaningful response to the fire that it was supposed to be an answer to. Nero's mass executions of the city's Christians were interpreted by his target audience as irrelevant violence by a leader who had never had the city's trust any less than he did now. Before Nero blamed the Christians, all of the Roman historians are quite free with the opinion that Nero, they already had reason to blame Nero himself. Blaming Christians was just too little too late in the Roman mind. Indeed, the first major Roman conspiracy to assassinate Nero, known as the Piso Conspiracy, unfolded in the very next year, in AD 65. Nero's estranged childhood tutor, Seneca, was implicated in the Piso Conspiracy, and it cost him his life. People, after the fire, seriously lost confidence that Nero had any kind of serious interest in the public good. And that was not tolerable. The next year, AD 66, saw the beginning of the Jewish revolt. Fighting broke out in the streets of Caesarea. Around the same time, the Roman procurator at the time, Jassius Florus, claimed 17 talents out of the temple treasury in Jerusalem. That's 1,200 to 1,700 pounds worth of monetary wealth. Some Jews publicly mocked the move by taking up a fake collection for him in the streets. And Florus massacred them, or tried to massacre all of them, but the public outcry was so great that Florus gave up and retreated to Caesarea, taking most of the Roman soldiers that had been stationed in Jerusalem with him. At that point, the Zealots and the Sicarii had the room they needed to start fighting the Romans openly in Jerusalem. The majority of populations of Judea and Galilee joined them within that year. You can see here, this is a map of Galilee, Samaria, Judea. These are all the places where revolt coins have been found. Coins bearing inscriptions like "For the redemption of Holy Jerusalem." This one's really hard to make out. Perhaps in Aramaic, year 1 to the freedom of the Jewish people. By AD 67 or 68, these are continuing. This is a coin dating to year 2 for the freedom of Zion in the inscription. Year 3 for the freedom of Zion in the inscription. In AD 67, when Nero turned his gaze to handling the Jewish revolt, that, in my opinion, is the last reasonable date for Paul's death, assuming that he'd already survived a trial with Nero or Nero's post-fire persecution. We simply don't know. Nero could have continued to have it out for Christians in particular after his major persecution episode, even though he lacked the social currency to get away with another big event. And the revolt may have made a difference in that or not. The same goes for Peter. As for when Peter wrote his 2 letters, his stated audience for the first letters were believers in the eastern provinces, again, of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. That's in 1 Peter 1. And commentators have considered the idea that Peter wrote these documents, that Peter wrote his 2 letters to edify believers after Paul was no longer around to do so. If Paul's dead, then who's going to, take the helm of encouragement? And the answer may have been Peter, but he didn't have long to do it if he did. Since our best evidence of the end of Peter's life in the early church's understanding is that both he and Paul were killed under Nero, who died in June of 68, that emperor must have killed them beforehand. On the front end, Peter referenced Paul's writings, which could include one or more of the house arrest epistles he wrote in 62. So the latest window we have for 1st and 2nd Peter is AD 63 to the first half of 68. The hardest documents to pin down, of course, are Jude and Hebrews. 2nd Peter clearly uses Jude as a resource, and Hebrews, Hebrews is the trickiest of them all. In truth, it may have been written before Nero died, or even after Titus destroyed the temple in AD 70. People are fond of assuming that Paul wrote it, but there's some issues with that. One is that the fundamental lesson of Hebrews is how Christ relates to law and the traditions of Judaism, right? Well, we know how Paul made that argument. We have it in Galatians, we have it in Romans, and when Paul argues that point, he tends to argue it fairly consistently in the letters that we have that bear his name. Hebrews runs on an entirely different fuel of argumentation. It's diesel, Paul's letters are unleaded, it's just a different thing. It's a different vehicle of ideas. And 2, Timothy is called our brother, but Paul constantly preferred to discuss Timothy with their fellow believers as his son. So Timothy's treated differently, and also Timothy is released from prison in contemporaneous with the writing of the book of Hebrews. We have no reason, based on Acts and Paul's letters, to believe that Timothy was one of the people who got arrested while Paul was in Rome. And if Timothy had been arrested in Nero's Rome, he probably would have just been killed along with Peter and Paul and not released, which suggests that Timothy was not imprisoned in Nero's Rome, which means that he was either imprisoned somewhere else or he was imprisoned later. So Hebrews could be written later. But all that to say, Hebrews, with its novel argument for the relation of Jesus to law and Judaism and its distinctions of Timothy, seems to come together to the idea that Hebrews seems to represent an inspired endeavor, a novel endeavor by someone in the Pauline circle to further engage biological Israel in the Eastern Roman provinces with the gospel. And that's a beautiful thing, right? Since Paul had once written to the church in Rome that he would give up his own salvation if it would mean the salvation of his fellow Israelites. It's a shame that in evangelistic practice, the Gentile church has largely set that endeavor aside. But one day at a time. It is the new year. Any questions? Annas II, a high priest who was under the authority of Herod's great-grandson, King Agrippa II. Annas II, according to Josephus, had James executed in the brief moment that he could get away with it without Roman oversight. And then Agrippa II promptly deposed him upon complaint by the Pharisees. Other questions? AD 62 is the generally agreed upon date for the death of James, which is easy to date if Annas did it with a lack of Roman oversight, because we have the procurator dates pretty well set.
In determining canonicity of these writings, did they use your same methodology? Or to what extent did they use it?
The ultimate methodology of the early church in sorting out canonicity was what was written by the apostles and what was written by their closest disciples. That seems to have been their de facto and ultimate rule of thumb, right? If something could not be successfully traced back to the apostles or their closest disciples, it doesn't seem to have really received the reception and effort of preservation that, even though we do have other documents, we have 4 canonical gospels, for instance, but in truth, there are over a dozen preserved accounts of Jesus' life dating from the 1st and 2nd century. It's just that only 4 of them were palatable in the long term, based on their pedigree of authorship. Other thoughts, questions? Yes, sir. Do I have an opinion on who the author of Hebrews is? One of my favorite things that I read this week is I think it was Origen who said, God only knows who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. and he was like 1,500 years closer than we are now. So I don't know why we've got our undies in a bundle, but we need to chill out about that. But Hebrews it's easier to say why someone didn't write Hebrews than who most obviously did, because it's just not obvious, except that they must have been within the circle of Paul's and Timothy's acquaintances and invested in the gospel and the Jewish community. And if it was in the eastern provinces, if it was even like in Asia, there were major strong diaspora communities. It's just that this novel argument would have probably been made to one who didn't already have Paul's argument on the table, right? Because Peter, for instance, says, you have the writings of Paul, and there are people in his audience who have actually received the writings of Paul, and he leverages that, especially if Paul is dead at the time. Hebrews actually doesn't make any of that kind of appeal. It doesn't say, you remember when Paul told you. The Hebrew writer doesn't say, you have this letter that was sent to you. You've had it for years. That doesn't happen. So it could very well be a novel audience as well as a novel argument. Yes, sir.
So the canonicity of Jude, is a large part of that based on the fact that 2 Peter borrows from you?
Yes, Jude got by on the skin of his teeth, riding on the coattails of Peter's acceptance and popularity. Yes, absolutely. But I'm sure I am glad that he made it, and I think God had a hand in that. Other thoughts or questions? Okay. God loves you. Bye-bye.